where my parents met in Acapulco, Mexico. My mom, who is Hungarian and French, spoke English and French, while my dad, who is Mexican, spoke Spanish and had just begun to study English at his university. Despite the language obstacles in the beginning, their love, perseverance, and love for language has deeply influenced my own journey. When I was 5 years old, we moved from Acapulco to Aston, Pennsylvania, a small suburb outside of Philly. My mom's pediatrician from Mexico had advised my parents to only speak Spanish with me at home for fear that speaking in more than one language would confuse my language learning. We now know that's a myth, and research shows the cognitive and academic benefits of learning more than one language at a time. My parents listened to the pediatrician, and my dad made it a rule that only Spanish was to be spoken at home. In school in Pennsylvania, I was an extremely shy and introverted student. Not only was I shy, but we were also the only Spanish-speaking Mexican family in the whole school. For the first few years of school, I passed as being just like the other students. I avoided speaking, often resorting to whispering when I had to repeat something. I learned to mimic what other students were doing and saying, and I relied on nonverbal cues to understand what was being said. I avoided doing anything that would get me in trouble or cause me to have to speak or participate. No one realized that I actually didn't understand English. When I reached 3rd grade, however, I wasn't able to hide anymore. The class was much more participatory, with students being called on to read out loud or answer questions for the entire class. It became clear I wasn't reading or comprehending what was going on in class, and I was often in my own world. My teacher became frustrated and sometimes angry with me. My desk was even moved next to hers, and she often held up my work that had not been done correctly for others to see. Finally, when she realized I wasn't responding to my name, but she was calling me Tania, not Tania, she called my parents and told them she wanted me tested for special education because she suspected I may be autistic. My parents came into the school to meet with her and explained to her that I spoke a lot at home and never had trouble following directions or responding in Spanish. That's when she realized it wasn't about ability or intelligence, it was about language. At the time, ESL bilingual education was not offered at this school. I was placed in speech class to improve my English pronunciation and projection of my voice, but there were no interventions or attempts to build my language or vocabulary. Later on in my career, I would realize that several of my civil rights as an emergent bilingual student had been violated. Fortunately, in 4th grade, I was blessed with my favorite teacher, Mr. Phillips, who was kind, supportive, and genuinely cared about me. He also happened to be the only teacher of color I would have in my K-12 schooling. He helped me to improve my English, learn to not only read, but to love reading. And I would call my parents after school to update them on my progress. Although we moved around a lot during my schooling, Mr. Phillips continued to write supportive and encouraging letters. And it was because of him that I started to think I wanted to be a teacher. And I began to teach my stuffed animals and my sister at home. In high school, I was still afraid to speak in front of people. I couldn't get up in front of the class and deliver a speech without turning bright red, and I struggled to project my voice. In college, my public speaking professor told me that I would never be able to become a teacher because of my difficulties with public speaking, and encouraged me to think about a different profession. I refused to be discouraged and persevered, fueled by my passion to be like Mr. Phillips and prove everyone wrong. I did go on and become a bilingual teacher. In front of my students, I could be my authentic self, and I didn't feel like people were judging me. I didn't get embarrassed, turn bright red, or feel like I needed to whisper. I loved teaching, and I loved the passion for learning that my students and I shared. I made it a priority to infuse culture and language into our classroom community. And in spite of many other challenges, we created our own beautiful, empowering bilingual learning world where we could focus on our studies without worrying about anything else outside of our classroom. However, About 7 years later, I stepped out of my classroom to become a bilingual reading interventionist and instructional facilitator, and was working with pre-service teachers, and I began to see education in a different light. I witnessed unequal access to resources, a curriculum that focused solely on Eurocentric values, racial biases, and inequitable instructional practices from teacher to teacher and school to school. I realized that what was happening outside of our classroom absolutely impacted us, and I had made a mistake by not engaging and talking openly about those injustices in my classroom with my students. I knew I needed to improve and change my teaching and start to speak out about these injustices, in spite of my fear of public speaking. One afternoon, our instructional superintendent visited our school to talk to us about our performance ratings. He stood up in front of our staff and presented data indicating that we were not performing well according to the district's frameworks. As I listened, I realized that the data had been manipulated by excluding certain test scores where we as a school had demonstrated growth and progress, making us appear much worse off than we actually were. As he spoke, I desperately wanted to get up and challenge what he was saying, but my lifelong anxiety with speaking in public was so strong that my body grew tense and my stomach tightened. I could hardly breathe, but I managed to speak the words that needed to be asked. I said, "You've observed and worked with our teachers. You've seen what our students are producing. Do you agree with how the data is being presented, or will you support us and challenge the district?" I was shaking while I spoke. I'm sure my voice cracked, but I was able to get the words out. To my disappointment, but not surprise, the instructional superintendent talked around my question and ended the meeting abruptly. Later, my principal was told to control your staff because of my comments. The moment of speaking truth to power was a turning point for me. Even though it didn't help the outcome for the school, I found a voice I didn't realize was there. And as Audre Lorde says, the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation and always seems fraught with danger. We fear the visibility without which we cannot truly live. Yet being seen, being valued, is a fundamental aspect of human dignity and well-being, connected to our human rights. I worked for Denver Public Schools in different roles for 18 years before making a big change to working in higher education and pursuing a doctoral degree. My research focused on Latinx pre-service students and how they navigated unjust systems, policies, and processes while attending college and school-based internships. In particular, I looked at the different types of resistance. Positive resistance, such as resilient resistance and transformational resistance. I wanted to know how students' critiques of social oppression and motivation of social justice supported them in positive resistance towards unjust school systems and policies. One of my students, Dolores, who was part of my research study, always stopped by my office to talk to me before her classes, and we would check in with how school, her internships, and just life were going. One day, she talked about how frustrated and angry she was feeling in one of her classes when the students, primarily white students, would share stories about the Latinx children and communities they were working with. They often spoke about them in a deficit-based way. These poor kids, they lack this, they lack that, they won't catch up, their families don't care. Dolores said, "They don't realize they're actually talking about me. I'm from the same community. If I'm going to be a teacher, I have to learn to speak for myself and for my kids." Well, not in that white savior way, but showing them that we have a connection. We grew up and we speak the same way. Dolores wanted to say something so badly, but instead, she chose to be silent and not participate in class anymore. Over the next couple of weeks, her frustration grew. In each conversation with me, she would analyze the entire class discussion, and she would rehearse what she should have said or what she might do next time. Finally, towards the end of the semester, she had the courage to speak up, and she challenged those stereotypical ways of thinking that were being portrayed in the classroom. Instead of feeling silenced and marginalized, she found her voice. She spoke up and she pushed back. Resistance in classroom is sometimes seen as self-defeat or acting out. When students complain about injustices they experience, the reactions from others can range from being dismissive or defensive to denying the validity of their experience, and at times, even branding them as entitled. What if we looked more deeply and saw the various forms of resistance from our students, from silence and disengagement to arguing, as an indication that there might be conflict or struggle, a struggle against injustice, oppression, and silencing? I am now fortunate to find myself in a place professionally where my passion for equity, social justice, civil rights, and culturally and linguistically diverse students intersects in a serendipitous way. And I still don't like public speaking, but I do it anyway to help create opportunities and access for others. It has been a long road to get here. As a child, I became invisible because I didn't speak English until a teacher saw me and heard me and inspired me to become a teacher. And in spite of who told me I couldn't do it, I resisted and I persisted. Overcoming obstacles, fighting for one's agency and voice are the beginnings and fundamental aspects of civil rights movements. Whether it be through resisting, acts of protest, civil disobedience, or simply refusing to accept the status quo, the fight for civil rights requires a deep sense of resilience, determination, and hope. I end with a call to action. As you interact with your students and colleagues, encourage them to share more stories and experiences about themselves, and just listen. Then help nurture and cultivate a path towards transformational resistance through dialogue, collaboration, and collective action. When a student, a colleague, or a friend engages in any kind of resistance, listen closely to the smallest whisper or the loudest scream. It is a call for equity. It is a call for justice. It is a call to action. Thank you.